First of all, thank you. We stuck our neck out last year and started to have these history presentations. Some of you have been here more than once, some of you it's your first time. Thank you, because last year was a real success. Our first show we had 30, the last one we had standing room only with over 60. And it's helping our community, because if we don't offer things, people do not come. You can't just sit here and say, how come they're not here? You have to tell them, you have to invite them, you have to let them know. So, thank you all. We are a nonprofit. We have no paid employees. We are supported by grants, donations, and a little help from the city of Prescott, and a little help from Pierce County, and a few other organizations like that. Chamber of Commerce is a great thing. Our presentation is made possible by the Chamber of Commerce. We just got a grant from them today as a tourism grant. The city of Prescott, Pierce County Tourism Committee, the Prescott Foundation, Ken and Deanna Rowan family, the Bob and Alice Merkert family, Jessica and Todd London, and many smaller donations from people like you. And so at the end of the show, if you think we're any good, and you think we entertained you, at least that's his job, for an hour, please consider helping us keep the door open, because whether you believe it or not, it's over $10,000 a year to run these two buildings. And we have done marvelously well. The thing is, we have a solid core. I am aided by a number of people, and I need to thank them because you don't know who they are. Mary Pat House, Errol Morella, Elise Block, Chris Faltasak, Tom and Kathy Oss, Shar Malik, Susan Metcalf, Trish Foreman, Tanya Kaipe, Mary Boland, Joe Globitz, Linda Bjorklund, Tom Blank, Tracy Frannick, Tim Paul, and myself, Dallas Eggers. So they are about 15 or 16 of us who make it work. Excuse us for the mess. We a renovation job of painters. They still got about 2 or 3 days to finish these old buildings, and it looks marvelous. Our windows have been redone. They've tuck pointed, they've repainted, they've sealed our building up, and I think they say we're good for another 30 to 40 years. So let's hope so. Also, we're always looking for new members, because people say, I don't know the history. You don't have to know the history. When somebody walks in, you introduce yourself and say, hi, my name's Bob, how can I help? Because you find out the people who come to these history centers are really interesting people. We've had, in the last 2 years, we've had people from 17 different countries come here. And Tourism Wisconsin, when they found that out, they started helping us, because we're helping the state of Wisconsin. So, remember, at the end of today's show, if you think we're worth something, donate a couple shekels or shells or tulip bulbs or whatever you use for collection. We appreciate it. And we hope that you tell your friends and neighbors to come to Prescott. We have a lot to offer. Our riverfront is historic. There's a beautiful river walk. As you walk out the door, remember the yellow brick road? Well, ours says follow the white arrow, and it takes you down between the bridges, underneath the railroad bridge to Merkert Mill Park, 2 blocks, and it's a beautiful history walk. So, with no further ado, I would like to, he was an acquaintance, turned into a good friend, Captain Lee Hendrix, over a 50-year career on the river. He is a writer, he is a lecturer, he is a river warrior par excellence, and he's a bit of a goofball sometimes too, and that's always wonderful. So, with no further ado, Captain Lee Hendrix.
Thank you. Kind of feel like Mussolini or something.
You're taller.
I'm taller. Okay. I'm a little more honest too. Maybe. So, nice to have you all here. Anybody here ever work on a towboat? Oh, damn, what am I going to do with y'all? If I tell a lie, y'all got to keep it to yourself, okay? Because see, the rest of them, I can tell them about damn near anything I want to. No, I'm going to be starting with some jokes because this is not funny, okay? This is a really sad story. Has anybody here ever heard of the Titanic? All right. Has anybody here heard of the Sea Wing? Yeah. Okay, before tonight, has anybody heard of the Sultana? Well, that's more than usually are. So, this took place not around here. This took place down on lower Mississippi River. And the lower Mississippi River is a much different culture. Now, it's funny about me, I was born in St. Louis. When I'm here, people think, man, you sound like you're from Gone with the Wind. But when I'm down there, you sound like a Yankee boy. So there's something kind of in between in St. Louis. But when you're down on the lower, down in the south, they take you, instead of saying you, all of you, they have an expression called y'all, okay? Has anybody ever said y'all that before?
Yes.
Okay, so kind of to get into the spirit of the South, why don't you just turn to the person sitting next to you and saying, hi, y'all. Hi, y'all. You're picking up on it really well. Okay. All right, let's talk about the Sultana. Oh, the Sultana, I call it a death cross. And what happened was, it was two axes. One axis was steamboats and the danger of being on a steamboat. The other axis was the Civil War. And these two cultures came together to bring about the worst disaster in nautical history in the United States. So, let's talk about steamboats first. So before the first steamboat was on the river, the only way they would get up and down the river was either in keelboats or flatboats. Now flatboats were strictly one way. You could only go down the river. And when you got down to where you were going, a lot of times, usually down around the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, they would unload the cargo and then they would tear that boat apart. And there was a lot of hardwood going into the making of that flatboat, and they would sell it. And then they would walk back, or if they had made a lot of money, they would get a horse or a mule. And as you can imagine, on that trek all the way back to Indiana, West Virginia, Ohio, so a lot of people knew that they were doing that. So it was very dangerous because there was a lot of outlaws on that Natchez Trace Trail or the other trails that those flatboatmen were using. So it was a dangerous thing to do, and you didn't make a whole lot of money doing it, but you could get by doing it. Now the other way was on a keelboat. Now a keelboat could go back up the river, but it was not mechanized. You had to have poles to push yourself back up against the current, or you would just send a group of people over on the bank and they would actually take a line, a rope, and they would pull that boat, that keelboat, back up the river. Really arduous work. So you can imagine they weren't making a whole lot of money doing that either, because especially when you consider all the work they were doing. So somebody was waiting to bring them into the 19th century. And that person who brought boating into the 19th century, well, of course, there was Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston. But a man named Nicholas Roosevelt took the first steamboat, called the New Orleans, from Pittsburgh down to New Orleans. And I won't get into all the adventures they had, but he and his wife Lydia and a small crew, they went through a lot of things like an earthquake and like attacks by Indians and like going over a waterfall in the Ohio River. But anyway, they got down to New Orleans in 1811 in December, and that ushered in the era of steamboats. So not to get too technical with all this, but even though steamboats now were the zeitgeist of the time, because now you can go back up against the river and you've got a mechanized way to do it, they were really dangerous. And the big dangers that they had in ascending order of danger was, number one, having a collision with another boat. Now, I read a book by a man named Lewis Hunter, who wrote the definitive history of steamboats on the Western rivers. Hello, how you doing?
Good.
We're having a test? No. Glad to have you. So Lewis Hunter, he recorded all the things, all this stuff that happened on these boats from 1811 to 1851, right before the Steamboat Safety Act was passed by Congress in 1852. There was 44 collisions between steamboats. Now, if you prorate that, that's a little more than one a year, which is really not bad. We have more than that now, a lot more than that. But they were smaller boats, so they could maneuver around each other, so they didn't run into each other a whole lot. There's 44 incidences of that. Groundings, running onto a sandbar, a rock bar, a snag or a sawyer. Who knows what a snag and a sawyer is? I know he does. Tell him what a snag and a sawyer is, Stephen.
Well, technically a sawyer is a snag, I think, but it's, snags are logs that are in the river, and some you can see and some you can't see. They're below. But a sawyer is one that disappears below the river with the current, and then over a period of, could be several minutes, rises up again. So if you're coming upstream and that sawyer raises its branches and you got a full head of steam on, there's really nothing you can do, and you run right onto it and sink.
Now the steamboats were all made out of wooden hulls, so when they ran into a snag or sawyer, chances are you're going to knock a big hole in the boat. But the thing about snags and sawyers and running aground, even if you knock a hole in the boat, normally it's going to sink, but you're going to have a chance to get off. So there, between 1811 and 1851, there was 567 documented cases of running aground or running up onto a snag or sawyer. But the worst two was number one, catching them on fire, right? Because you have a wooden hull, you have a wooden boat, you have it painted, you have what is basically an orderly pile of kindling that is the steamboat. You have fires in the boilers, you have people tending the fires who maybe drank a little whiskey, you've got cotton for a cargo, a lot of flammable things. So that there were 169. They got a little bored. I'm about to talk about the fires, boys. There was 169 incidences of boats catching on fire and burning up. You two guys are on towboats. You ever get on a towboat that caught fire? I was on a towboat that caught fire in 1995. It was the scariest, well, not the scariest thing that ever happened to me, but it was close to it. Now, luckily, we could run out on the barges. What happened was we had a clutch fire and we couldn't put it out, but we had a fixed CO2 system, put the fire out, also killed both engines. So we're going down the river with 40 barges and no engines.
Oh.
But you know what? It made it around this really gnarly bend. I mean, this flanking thing really kind of works. But anyway, so catching on fire was bad. 169 of those instances. But if you really wanted to have nightmares, a boiler explosion was the worst thing that could happen. Concussive force that would throw men, animals, pieces of metal, pieces of wood, anything on the boat, throw them hundreds of feet out onto the bank. Burning shards of timbers floating through the air, getting on people, burning people alive. But maybe the worst thing is when that steam would go into your clothes and burn your clothes into your skin. It sounds horrible, doesn't it? But that happened a lot. As a matter of, who's heard of Mark Twain? Everybody's heard of Mark Twain. Mark Twain's brother, Henry, was on a boat that blew up, the Pennsylvania, and he died of his wounds from from boiler explosions. So boiler explosions were the worst. Okay, so now let's talk about the Civil War, because this is going to come into the axis of death, cross of death. 600 to 800,000 people were killed during the Civil War. There was 500,000 people who were wounded. And when you were wounded, a lot of times, if it was in an extremity on your arm or on your leg, they just amputated your arm or your leg. This was the quickest thing to do. And they didn't use a whole lot of anesthetic for this. So as gruesome as that sounds, maybe the worst thing that could happen to you was to be captured and to be put into a prisoner of war camp. Now, the Bible talks about taking care or treating humanely prisoners. Well, we know throughout history that's a lot of pixie dust. Prisoners don't get treated humanely almost anywhere. But in a war like this, especially like the Civil War, where General Sherman is marching to the sea, burning everything out in front of him and behind him, you're going to have a lot of things to give to the Yankee prisoners? No, you're not going to have them. There was a prisoner of war camp in Georgia called Fort Sumter. And of the 45,000 people who had been interned, thank you, God. Oh man, look at that, right on cue. Of the 45,000 Union prisoners of war who were interned in Fort Sumter between February 1864 and when the camp was liberated in April of 1865, 13,000 of those people died. There was 5,000 left when the camp was liberated. Over a 30% rate of death in Andersonville prison. There was other prisons too, and I'm going to show you a picture of Andersonville later. It was a hideous place to wind up. So let's talk, see if I can get this going here. Dallas gave me
The wheel on the town.
the wheel on top. So I'm looking at the Sultana.
Don't push it, just turn it to you. There you go. Go. Remember, you got it.
Okay, April 9th, 1865. That is the day that Robert E. Lee surrenders to U.S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. About a week later, now this is wrong. I don't know. I apologize for this. This whole series of PowerPoints was given to me by a friend, and he'd had wrong dates. Lincoln was actually shot on April 14th, and he died. He was shot by John Wilkes Booth on April 15th. This says 16th. Booth leaps, it's at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. Booth leaps out of the balcony where Lincoln is. He lands onto the stage, and he yells, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus die tyrants." He was a real Southern sympathizer. Broke his leg, but he got away because he had some accomplices, and it was about a week later that they caught him, and he was killed as he was being captured. He went down. So, all this is going on. Here is Andersonville prison camp. You can see what people were, what the living conditions were like. People were crowded together. There was very little shelter for them, very little clothing, a lot of disease going around, but the thing that killed more people than anything else was the malnutrition. There was just not enough food because, again, General Sherman was marching to the sea and burning everything out in front of him. So even the Confederate soldiers didn't have enough to eat, didn't have clothing. They sure didn't have anything to give to the Yankee prisoners. This is a picture of Andersonville prison camp. And if you look real closely, you can see a creek, okay? Does everybody kind of see that creek? I can't point it, but that creek had multiple uses. You drank out of it, you went to the bathroom in it, and you bathed in it. So hopefully you drank upstream from where you peed. This ring around Andersonville prison was called the deadline. So if you tried to get over that first barrier into the second barrier, you were shot on sight. I read a story about a guy who was interned there, and he saw this happen with his own eyes. They loaded dead prisoners up in a wagon and pulled them with some mules to an open grave, a common grave, and they threw 50 dead people into the common grave. And on the way back, they brought mush back for the prisoners to eat. And the maggots from the dead bodies came up through the mush. These men were so starving that he said they fought like hungry dogs to get that mush. Now, this may sound like an indictment of the Confederacy. I suspect that a lot of the prisoner of war camps in the North weren't a lot better. It was just at this point in time, 1864 and 1865, the North had a lot more resources at their disposal than the Confederates did. The war basically was over. Anybody been to Vicksburg, Mississippi? I know you have. So at Vicksburg, Mississippi, that was the key battle in the whole Civil War, because Lincoln had this plan called the Anaconda Plan, and his Anaconda Plan was to strangle the southern states so they couldn't ship cotton or anything that they could use. Yes?
You're getting too close to that speed.
Oh, well, thank you.
That's what's happening.
I wondered what was going on there. I knew it.
Go back up.
Okay, go back up this way.
There you go.
I like to walk around, you know.
Yeah, that's fine.
So Vicksburg was the key battle in the Civil War, 1863. It was when the North won that battle, the gig was up. But the South thought that they could inflict enough pain and agony on the North where they could get some concessions from Lincoln. So the war is still going on even after it's basically already over. So the commandant, Captain Wirtz, at this hellhole here, he was executed after the Civil War in November of 1865 for war crimes. There's a lot of debate about whether he should have been executed or not. This is another, they didn't have any barracks. They were all out in tents or anything that they could camp out under. They didn't have, like I said, the clothing. Sometimes when they would die, somebody would come and steal their clothing and give it to someone else. It was like a prison with barbaric things going on. This is another prison of war camp called Camp Cahaba. This was in Alabama. It wasn't quite so bad there at Camp Cahaba, but it was still a pretty miserable place to be. And here you see a picture of the men lying out in the rain or the snow or the sun or just whatever the elements were. There was no escaping the elements, and no food, no clothing. It was, you can see why the death toll was so big there. Okay, so now the war is winding down, and it's March of 1865, and if they had a Nobel Peace Prize back then, it should have been given to either General Fisk on the North, and I forget the man's name with the Confederacy. He was the commandant of Cahaba prison, but they came together and they said, hey, look, because at the beginning of the war, they had actually had prisoner exchanges. And they said, you know, look, swear to God that you're not going to come back and we'll let you go, because we really don't want to spend money on keeping you in a prison camp. You just make a promise that you're not going to come back. And most of them said, yeah. And most of them live up to it. But take this as you want. After 1863 and after the Emancipation Proclamation, that practice stopped. Once African American soldiers were in blue uniforms, they stopped the practice of trading of prisoner exchanges. So that didn't happen anymore, and that's why you had all those overcrowding and those disgusting, despicable conditions in those prisons. But anyway, those two men got together and they decided that, look, this war is over. These people are not going to fight again. We need to get them back home. So they had a meeting at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they said, we're going to parole these people and send them back home, because the war is just about over. But there's all the rail lines in the country, at least the ones going north and south, they had all been destroyed, because that's a tactic. You destroy the rail lines. So how are we going to get them back home? We're going to send them back up by a steamboat. We're going to bring them to Vicksburg, Mississippi, because if you took a longitudinal line from those prisons, Cahaba and particularly Andersonville, it's like 429 miles, we still had to get them to Vicksburg and load them up on steamboats. Now from Andersonville, the first thing they did was put them on a train that had somehow made it through the war. It was a filthy old train, and a lot of the people died because they were so emaciated and so in such bad shape, malnourished, that they didn't even make it on that train ride to a place in Alabama where they could get on another steamboat, go over into western Alabama, get on another filthy train, took them to Jackson, Mississippi, and then they walked 40 miles from Jackson over to Camp Fisk, which was next to Vicksburg. A lot of them were barefoot when they were walking this 40 miles. A lot of them died along the way, but you know what? They were free and they could sense that they were going home. So, these prisoners of war are coming to Vicksburg, coming to Camp Fisk, and this is what Camp Fisk looked like. And there they would be paroled and put onto steamboats to take them back up to Illinois, Ohio, West Virginia, parts of Tennessee, wherever it was that they came from. You can see here some of the rail lines that had been destroyed during the war and trying to rebuild them. And of course the boats that they had were steamboats. Steamboats that were still dangerous to ride on. Now this is a stern wheeler, but that gives you an idea kind of what some of the steamboats might have looked like that they would load the prisoners up. But they're going to pay a lot of money. The government is to get these people back home. They're going to pay $5 for an enlisted man, which doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but in 1865 that was a good little payoff. And they're going to pay $10 for every officer. The steamboat we're going to talk about is the Sultana. The Sultana was built in Cincinnati in 1862. They put it on the river in 1863. It wasn't the grandest steamboat, but it was a pretty good ride for those days. It had 2 paddle wheels. That's why they called it a side wheeler. It's a funny thing about this, you know, their first trip out of Cincinnati, and I read this and I thought, well, how'd that happen? They were going to go up to Pittsburgh to take some cargo, and they got to Wheeling, and they found out they couldn't get underneath the bridge with the stacks. And I'm thinking to myself, well, wouldn't you have tried to find out how high that bridge was before you got there? And then how did they know? Did they run into the bridge and then find out that they couldn't make it? But anyway, they They couldn't make it to Pittsburgh, but they were commandeered during the war to shuffle troops and materiel during the war. The government could commandeer boats back in those days. The Sultana was 260 feet long, it was 40 feet wide, 7 feet deep. Paddle wheels were 35 foot in diameter. The bucket boards were 11 feet. It was a pretty cool ride. Burned coal, had 4 tubular boilers. It's licensed to carry, keep this in mind, licensed to carry 376 passengers, okay? 376. This was one of the captains, J. Cass Mason. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not your garden variety psychopath right there. He was from St. Louis. He was not only the captain of the boat, but he was also one of the owners of the boat. And he believed in pushing a boat hard, because the theory back then was those boats aren't going to last more than 5 years. So we're going to push them as hard as we possibly can to make as much money as we can, because the damn thing's going to blow up or sink anyway. So we're going to push it real hard and try to make our money back, and you could make your money back on a steamboat in about 6 months. That's how good the business was back then. J. Cass Mason had, yes?
Is this after the Steamboat Regulation Act the government passed?
Yes. So the Steamboat Regulation Act came in 1852. This is 1863. Okay, good question though. All right. J. Cass Mason had a pet alligator on board. Anybody ever think about having an alligator as a pet? I know. He did. So he was a very qualified captain. He just pushed his boat and ran it until something was gonna happen to it. So the Sultana is in St. Louis on April 13th of 1865, and they're getting ready to take a trip down to New Orleans. On April 15th, they get to Cairo. Now, what had just happened? Lincoln had just been assassinated, right? So they didn't have any telegraphs going through the South anymore to let people know that Abraham Lincoln was dead. One of the Sultana's missions was to tell everybody in the South that President Lincoln had been assassinated. So they're coming down the river, stopping at all the places and letting people know about this news that had happened. April 15th, they're in Cairo. April 17th, 1865, they get to Vicksburg, and they stop at Vicksburg, and a man boards that boat. His name is Reuben Hatch. I don't have a picture. This is a picture of a boiler. I'll show you Reuben Hatch later. But he's the quartermaster there, and he has had a reputation throughout the Army as padding his own pockets. So he gets on the Sultana and he goes finds Captain Mason, who Mason is just about broke too from the war. They're willing to do anything to make themselves a lot of money. Hatch gets on the boat and he hatches a plot. He says to Mason, I'll get you a lot of prisoners. You're going to have a lot of money, but you're going to have to give some of it back to me. So they make this plot together, and later that day on the 17th, Mason is pretty sure now when he gets back up to Vicksburg, he's going to have a lot of prisoners and to take up the river with him. But he gets down to New Orleans on April 19th, and they're due. They unload cargo and load more cargo back up. They get actually some paying passengers. They get some horses and hogs, some sugar, some other assorted cargo. But they don't leave New Orleans on the 20th like they're supposed to. So what could have happened is the chief, Nathan Wintrigger, who's the chief engineer on the Sultana, could have gone to Captain Mason and told him about this faulty boiler, the port boiler. it had ruptured, or it was close to being ruptured on the skin. Now, not to go too much into boiler technology, but when you have a boiler that's leaking water, you have excess steam pressure buildup, and it can be really dangerous. But they got to get back up to Vicksburg to pick up all these prisoners of war, right? These guys that they're going to take back. So he says, well, you know what, when we get to St. Louis, we'll fix it. They head up the river on April 21st, well, April 23rd, Chief Wintriger comes up to the captain, he says, hey man, he says, this boiler is really bad. We got to do something about it. We got to slow down. But what if they slow down, there's other steamboats in Vicksburg that are going to get all this business here with all these POWs. He said, we got to push it up there, and we get to Vicksburg, we'll get a boiler maker, and we'll see if we can't get that fixed. So they limp into Vicksburg on April 24th. They call a boiler maker, a man by the name of R.G. Taylor. Mr. Taylor comes down, and here you can see where the boilers, you see where that insert is there on the Sultana? It's a side wheeler, like I said. Side wheelers are a little different than stern wheelers. I never worked on a side wheeler. I worked on stern wheelers. Stern wheelers balance the weight out a little bit better because you got your boilers up forward and you got your paddle wheel aft. The side wheelers had most of that midship. But side wheelers were real popular on the lower Mississippi. But now you can see kind of like what those boilers look like. Remember, they've got like a lot of steam pressure in there, and if that steam pressure blows up, people get hurt. So they pull in there, and Taylor comes down, and he looks at the boiler, and he said, I got some bad news for you, Captain. I can't fix this thing in a couple hours. It's going to take me a week to fix it. What do you think Matt Mason thought about that? He was not happy about that at all. He wasn't going to get any prisoners of war. He said, I don't care what you got to do. You patch that rascal up. Just get me to St. Louis, and I'll get it fixed. When we get to St. Louis, I promise. Here's Reuben Hatch. And Reuben Hatch, when they get into Vicksburg, he comes back down to the boat and they start scheming. This was a banner day for grift, okay? All these steamboats there, all trying to load as many prisoners of war together as they can because the payoff is so good. And Reuben Hatch was very well connected with Abraham Lincoln. So he was kind of Teflon, Reuben. Nothing going to happen to him. But he's going to try to line his pockets as best he can. He's got an associate named Frederick Speed, Captain Speed, and he tells Speed, he says, you get as many people on that Sultana as you possibly can, because the Sultana is part of this group called the Peoples and Merchants Steamboat Line. They had kind of come together in like Union Barge Line or Federal Barge Line or Wisconsin Barge Line. Or it was a group of steamboats that had formed a company together. And he said, you get as many people on there as you can, and I'm not telling you why, but you just do what I tell you to do. So Speed starts to load people up onto the Sultana, and they're coming on a rail line from Camp Fisk over to the landing at Vicksburg, and there is a good rail line there. It's only 4 miles, but somewhere in all this that's going on, Speed kind of loses track of how many train loads have actually come there, because he's got to run back and forth. He's got a really hard job. He's trying to do the best that he can. This will give you an idea what the prisoners of war, these are the people who were being loaded onto the steamboat. You can see what physical condition they might have been in. They load them up at the landing. They keep loading, keep loading. There's other steamboats there, but they're not getting any of this. All of them are going onto the Sultana. And this is a superimposition, that white vessel there, that's the Sultana. That black vessel there is the Titanic. That gives you an idea of how much bigger the Titanic was than the Sultana. So, Archie Taylor comes to Captain Mason and he says, okay, your boiler's repaired. Get it up to St. Louis and get it done, and don't call me again. When they left Vicksburg that night, or that afternoon, April 24th, 1865, this was on a boat that was supposed to have 376 people. There was 2,500 people on the Sultana.
Yeah.
Think about that for a minute.
Otherwise it didn't sink right
But
up.
Mason wants to, he wants to get him up the river as quick as he can, but even he knows something's not right here. He actually said, I just pray to God that I can get these people up to Cairo. I'd give my money back just to get them up to Cairo. So they leave. Cairo's where the Ohio and the Mississippi come together. They leave Vicksburg and they go up to Helena, Arkansas. This picture, this is the iconic photo of the Sultana. And you can see the conditions that they had on that boat. There weren't staterooms for those people. They had other paying passengers who had staterooms. But these folks are lying down next to boilers. They're laying any place they can get a couple minutes of sleep. They don't have any food. A lot of them have got diarrhea and dysentery. They don't have bathrooms for them. They're more crowded together than they were at Andersonville. But you know what? It's okay, because they're on their way home. After all the things they've been through in the Civil War, all the battles, Andersonville prison, taking those filthy train cars over to Fort Fisk, they're on their way home. They're happy. And they get to Helena, and a photographer came down and took that picture, and you can see how overcrowded everything was. It was a really a real fear that those decks would actually collapse from all those people being on them.
Yeah.
Or if they all ran to one side or another, that the boat would capsize. But this fellow in Helena takes this photo. It's April 26th. The evening of April 26th, they get to Memphis. They take some of the sugar off the bottom deck, made the boat even less stable, because now almost all the weight is up higher up above. The boat's rolling back and forth like that. They got to be real careful about them staying in one place. They leave. Some of the people do get off the boat in Memphis for whatever reason. Some of them just went up to get drunk. And the lucky ones got so drunk that they didn't make it back. And they left Memphis that night, went up the river just a mile or two to get some coal for fuel. That night they left the coal yard, and on April 27th, this happened. 2 o'clock in the morning. Remember those boilers are all funky? Boilers blew up. There's shards of metal flying through the air. Their bodies are being pierced by this. There's people being blown off of the boat hundreds of feet. The pilot gets knocked out of the pilot house. There's no way to control the boat anymore. This is what it might have looked like. Human beings, human torches. So, I guess that if you're going to do anything you can to keep from burning alive, right? So what are you going to do? You're going to jump in the river, right? Well, the river's at flood stage. The river's like 2 miles wide. So maybe you can the fire didn't start right away after the boilers exploded. The fire started a little bit later, after the smokestacks collapsed. So smokestacks collapsed, broke the decks through. So there's human beings on this boat actually being pinned by burning boughs or burning pieces of wood from the boat. They can't move some of them. The lucky ones maybe do get a chance to jump into the river. But now, not only is the river 2 miles wide, so they're not going to be able to swim to shore, but it's April, okay? It's not warm water. It's like 50 to 60 degrees. So when you have a water that's 50 to 60 degrees, then you start to lose dexterity after about 15 to 20 minutes, and you start to lose consciousness after 1 hour. So a lot of these people are dying of hypothermia, drowning. They're still trying to jump off the boat as best they can, because if they can cling to something, maybe they can make it over to the bank and somebody will rescue them. Here's another picture of what it might look like. Now there's a real late arrival right there. This guy is an FRN. Now, I know that sounds like
Friendly river nut.
yeah, okay, yeah, he's a friendly river nut, yeah. You're gonna be tested on all this. So anyway, so here's the Sultana burning. People are doing anything they can. Now, Captain Mason, as much as he was to blame for all this, he actually performed pretty honorably toward the end. He died toward the end. And this would have been the burned out hull. Now, some of the people actually went forward onto the bow of the boat, and the flames didn't get them there, but with no way to control it. When you're on a boat and you learn what to do when a boat catches fire, you want to point the boat in a direction where the flames will be blown away from the rest of the boat. Now, you can't always do that, but that's what you try to do. But they didn't have the pilot was blown out of the pilot house, so there was no way to control it. The flames were going all over the place, helter-skelter. There was a boat in the area called the Bostona 2. It came down the river, and it was able to pick some of the passengers up out of the river and carry them down to Memphis. This explosion happened at a place called Patty's Hen and Chickens. We don't call that anymore, but it's not very far from Memphis. There's a series of islands that they called it back then. They picked them up, and then they told everybody in Memphis, and Memphis was known as the Good Samaritan City, and there were people going on small boats and anything they could find to pick these people up out of the river. Remember, the war had just ended like a couple of weeks ago. So now you've got Southern people picking Yankees up out of the river. It was humanity now, not about politics or anything. And this is Memphis. They set up like a field hospital, and they were able to get like 700 people up out of the river. But of those 700, 200 of them died of their wounds in Memphis or wherever it was that they floated to the bank. So about 500 people survived this, is what I have read. Now there's 2 books that are really good on this. One of them is written by a man named Jerry Potter. It's called the Sultana Disaster, and the other one is Disaster on the Mississippi by Gene Saliger. Nobody's really sure how many people died. Saliger seems to think it was only like 1,100, which is bad enough. But the official total that the War Department said was like 1,700. So it's, things that happened back in those days, even when you're talking about the people dying, it was kind of an estimate, unfortunately. Now there was a conspiracy theory. Even back then people had conspiracy theories. And one of the theories was that Southern sympathizers had loaded torpedoes up into coal. Remember what I talked about? They stopped to load coal up when they left Memphis? That they had loaded something explosive into the fuel. And there was another one that somebody had come up with some dynamite and thrown it in. But those theories are pretty much debunked by historians. Really what happened was those boilers that they had let slide, they had blown up. And that's what led to that, plus the overcrowding of the boat. This is a picture of what might happen. Remember, that boat is rolling back and forth. So that boiler that's over to the left there, now it's probably getting some water, but that boiler to the right, because the boat is pivoting on an axis, it's not getting as much water as it should, and it's starting to build up pressure. Now, the engineer who was on watch, his name was Samuel Clemens, swore that they had 135 psi, which was pretty normal bucking up against the current. He was not Mark Twain Samuel Clemens. He just happened to be named Samuel Clemens. That gives you kind of an idea what those boilers look like. And even when the boat's rolling even more, you can see what gravity's doing. And that boiler there is getting really hot. And then this is the tragedy that happens. They had more people on that boat than any boat on the western rivers had ever had on a steamboat. There was more people loaded than had ever happened before. They had more people on there than they had on the Titanic in 1912. And more people died. So, what happened? Somebody's got to be responsible for this tragedy, right? Well, not really. Captain Mason died that night. Hatch, remember his brother's really well connected with Abraham Lincoln. They're not going to do much to him. The chief engineer, Wintringer, he came before a board and he managed to put all the blame over onto the second engineer, Clemens, who died. So we'll blame the dead guy. So they blamed it on Clemens. Now Speed, he was the captain who was in charge of loading the people onto the boat. He was court-martialed, and he was found guilty. But a couple of years later, they said, you know, this guy he wasn't really greedy or anything. He didn't do anything to be court-martialed for. He could have been more careful. But anyway, he was honorably discharged, and really nobody suffered any consequences except the 1,800 people who died on the boat. I don't know where this picture came from, but that's kind of the picture of where this Patty's. A farmer in Arkansas was tilling his fields, and he found the Sultana buried in the silt. Okay. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't know, and I wouldn't have known except I read it, when they were in New Orleans, they took on a chest. One of the passengers was a rich person coming up, $30,000 in a chest in the captain's quarters. That's where they would figure was most secure. So that $30,000 went down with the Sultana. So if you ever go to Arkansas and you feeling lucky, you might dig up that $30,000. So it took a while, but of the survivors, which were there was about 500. After about 20 years, they started to get together and have reunions. You know, it took them 20 years to get to the point where they wanted to have a reunion about all this. But they would, you know, would come back together, and they really lobbied real hard, and they had help from other people about getting themselves some sort of a payout or a pension for what they went through. But the government didn't give them anything. They gave them $8 a month like everybody else who had been in the war. There is a, when I was stationed in Memphis with the Corps of Engineers, I noticed, I was just walking through this neighborhood and there was a plaque there about the Sultana. And there's another big one in Nashville. I think there's several others around the country. And there is now in Marion, Arkansas, if you ever go down there, there's a museum, small museum now, but they're making a bigger one. It's supposed to open sometime this year to commemorate that horrible incident in U.S. history, which it was a very horrible incident in history. So, I think Macbeth said it best. Out, brief candle. Life's like a walking shadow. A poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then a scene no more. Thanks. Questions? Yes, sir.
No, I just read about that alligator.
Yeah.
He supposedly, the guy stabbed it, that was on the, and used the box that the alligator was in to throw it in the water so he'd have something to float on.
You're right. I forgot that part. I couldn't remember it all. But yeah, this gentleman's right. So this guy knew that the alligator was there. He knew he was in that box, and he knew that that box could be some flotsam that he could, you know, use to stay afloat in the river, and killed the alligator, and then took the wood, and he was actually rescued later.
The destruction of the Sultana, Captain Hatch should have been hung. No question about it. The man should have been hung. If you buy the book and read it, and you come away with any other decision, I don't get it. He was, to me, he was the worst criminal of the entire story, and he got rich off of it. This kind of goes to...
There's two really good books. One is by Jerry Potter and one's by Gene Saliker, both about the same thing. But yeah, the Hatch was he hatched the plot,
Well, I've read the first one 3/4, and I got the other one for my birthday today. At his recommendation.
Well, Saliker actually did a lot of research on the people. So he actually had in the appendix of the book has where each of these people were from and how he thinks that they perished. So he did a lot of research. But you could buy one of those books, or on my Substack, if you don't want quite as detailed of analysis, I wrote a three-part story about the Sultana, and actually it's narrated by someone too. So if you're on Substack, you can see that. Stephen's got something to add. Go ahead.
No, I want to hear about your book. What's a peep like?
Oh, okay.
This is what it
Yes.
looks like on the outside. It's right here, soft cover and hardcover.
If you've never been on a towboat, at
Me?
night,
A bit
you don't know what a peep light is. Because there's a few pilots in the room, and when the peep light went out, the engine would go, and the pilot would send us out there to change the peep light. So it's a little bitty light bulb like this that is more important than you can possibly imagine. So
Yeah, there's a jack staff out there on the head of the tow. You can tell the judge the swing during the daylight, but at night you can't see it. So there's a little blue light out there called the peep light. So the pilot uses that to judge the swing of the tow at night.
But it's a great book for people who have never ridden a towboat.
It sure is.
So, our next speaker is Goran Pesek. He is going to focus on something much more local, on Lake Pepin. He is a high school history teacher in Pepin, Wisconsin, and he is the Lake Pepin historian that I know, and I'm looking forward to him. Our speaker series continues all summer long. Our last speaker is Nancy Earhart-Burt in October, and she is a direct descendant of Amelia Earhart.